Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Ambassador, Excellency, you're most welcome to the British School at Rome. It's a great pleasure to see everybody here this evening. This has been a remarkable few days of BSR activity. As everyone will be aware, we had a workshop to begin the week. We were talking about geophysics and heritage management. We'll finish on Friday with another workshop on our work at the Palazzo Imperial at Portus, led by our research professor Simon Kay with the Superintendency of Rome. Alongside all of that, of course, we have our marvellous exhibition, which comes to an end on Friday, which is related to the superb project Transnationalising Modern Languages, which Charles Burdett has organised from the University of Bristol in association with us. And in the middle of all this, this evening's lecture. And this range of activity really shows at its best the British School at Rome's stretch and spread across many different disciplines. It's also important that many of the projects have had at their heart people who have been associated for some time with the British School at Rome, Charles Burdett, Barbara Spadaro, Simon Kay, and this evening's lecture also no exception. For me, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Amy Russell to give this lecture, because Amy and I arrived at the British School at Rome at precisely the same time, pretty much in 2009, when Amy began her year of study at the British School at Rome after previous study in Oxford and at UC Berkeley. She then stayed in Rome to work at the Centro, then becoming even more familiar with every nook and cranny of the city and Italy, before very justly getting a position at the University of Durham and garnering more honours and more grants and more praise for the work that she does. Amy is known to many of you as an extraordinarily collegial and collaborative member of our community. She's also a brilliant scholar. She won't thank me for this, but one of the greatest scholars of the Roman Republic, Karl Holkerskamp, told me that her book, The Politics of Public Space in Republican Rome, was, in his opinion, the best book on Republican Rome for a decade, and I don't disagree. Amy has a capacity to combine archaeological evidence, topographical knowledge, and a really, really sharp and penetrating historical imagination, which sets her apart. We're therefore immensely grateful to Amy that she's come back and spent more time as a research fellow at the British School at Rome on her current project, which we will hear a little bit about, I think, in this lecture, the Imperial Senate and the City of Rome. Amy, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Christopher, and thank you all. It is wonderful to be back here at an institution that's meant so much to me for so long. So, the Imperial Senate and the City of Rome. When I started to put together the final draft of this lecture earlier this week, it seemed obvious that there was only one way to start the lecture. It seems much less funny today than it did yesterday, but let's see it anyway. I played that mostly to amuse you, but also to raise an important question. Why on earth is the Imperial Senate of any concern to us? When Cicero was consul of Rome, the Senate ruled the entire known world. Under the Empire, they were more or less pointless. Nobody has any serious doubts that Augustus and his successors did, as Tacitus wrote, concentrate in themselves all the powers of the Senate, the magistracies, and the laws. The Roman Principate was a monarchy, and everybody knew it. So why bother talking at all about this relic, this vestige, this hangover that is the Roman Imperial Senate? Okay, right. We're going to try this again. We did practice this all this morning. So we're not just being ridiculous. Well, I might be being slightly ridiculous. Okay, that is the end of the video, so I think we should be okay technologically from now on. So the Roman Imperial Senate matters in the first instance because the Roman emperors did not dissolve the council permanently. The last remnants of the old republic were not swept away. No Roman emperor during the period that I'm concerned with, which in the larger project is more or less Augustus to Constantine, took the drastic step of closing down the Senate. Not Augustus, not the tyrants like Caligula, Nero, or Domitian. No matter how transparent their autocracy might have been, they allowed the Senate to survive as an institution. That fact is remarkable in itself. So why did the emperors keep the Senate? Well, that's a whole different lecture, but one reason was precisely because they didn't want to sweep away the last remnants of the old republic. The Roman emperors, however obvious their power might have been, used a rhetoric of continuity rather than change. They paraded their devotion to republican tradition as one of the pillars of the new regime. The Senate was one of the main proofs of this continuity, and for that reason the Republican Senate will be a constant implicit and explicit point of comparison in what I'm about to say. So, I think it's important to talk about the Imperial Senate and what it did. And one of the things that it did, which doesn't get talked about a lot, was to build monuments in the city of Rome. So this evening I want to talk about the Senate and the city. I'll start by looking at the relationship between the Senate and the act of building new monuments, and how that changed from republic to empire and continued to be a source of tension well into the imperial period. Then I'll look at some of the monuments themselves. The analysis of the individual monuments and their decoration is the core of my larger project, though there won't be time to look at more than a few different facets of any of them tonight. And finally, I'll come back to the idea of building and ask why the Senate might have built these monuments and what it meant for their role in the imperial system. So, what was the relationship between the Senate and the city of Rome? We might equally say, what was the relationship between senators and the city? And that distinction between individual senators and senators as a group turns out to be important. Now, we're much more likely to associate the imperial city of Rome with emperors rather than senators. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, dominated public space. In the prestige spaces of the Forum Romanum, the Imperial Fora, or the newly developed parts of the Campus Martius, the viewer was entirely surrounded by buildings bearing the name of the princeps or his immediate family, buildings that he commissioned and paid for, buildings that quite literally had his name on them. And Augustus's successors took the imperial monopoly of the city to yet further heights. Nero's Golden House threatened to swallow the city entirely, while the Flavian rebuilding after the Great Fire reordered the city on a fundamental level. Later emperors changed the city's entire geography, flattening old hills and building new ones. No one could doubt whose city this was. In that respect, the imperial city of Rome was quite different from the republican city, which was primarily a space of competition. Opimius's temple jostled with Cato's basilica, and Sulla's curia dragged the viewer's attention away from either. Votive victory temples, placed cheek by jowl, reached heights of stylistic and architectural eclecticism and innovation, entirely devoted to the project of standing out from their neighbours. Every single surface in the city would have been covered with different memorials and dedications, all metaphorically screaming their patron's name. These were buildings put up, commissioned, and for the most part paid for entirely by individuals. These individuals, and of course they were all senators, had a very clear relationship to the city. It was one of their main arenas for the competitive display that was so fundamental to republican political life. But the Senate as a whole didn't have any obvious relationship to the city at all. Now, the kind of competitive building that's represented here largely disappeared from Rome's urban landscape in the imperial period. Though the stakes of elite competition were just as high, the audience and the terms of that competition had changed. Senators competed with each other outside Rome or in new media. Within Rome, the emperors were competing with other emperors, with the past and the future, rather than with their peers in the present. And the phenomenon even goes beyond public space. The physical Domus Caesaris on the Palatine and the emperor's haughty, massive pleasure gardens spread all around the Roman suburban greenbelt gradually appropriated the areas traditionally used even for private elite architectural display. In the Republic, a range of aristocratic families would have lived here on the Palatine and decorated their houses as part of a constant game of one-upmanship. Now, the whole hill has become the imperial palace. Still, if we're looking for senators in the imperial city, there are some nuances worth noting. Suetonius actually tells us that Augustus did encourage notable members of the Senate to contribute to the project of beautifying Rome. Now, Agrippa, with whom he finishes this quotation, I think we can discount. He was so closely attached to Augustus, and before too long was officially welcomed as a member of the imperial family with his marriage to Augustus's daughter Julia. We could say the same of Philippus too. And many of Suetonius' examples that he cites here are very early. They're even before Actium. They should probably be characterized as triumviral rather than Augustan, though not all. In the area of the Circus Flaminius in particular, we find a number of large-scale projects commissioned by other patrons. The portico of... What happened to the pointer? No. The portico of Philippus, which is here, and the amphitheatre of Statilius Taurus, which should be somewhere over here, were both built after Actium but before 27. But even after 27, the Theatre of Barbers, thank you, the Theatre of Barbers here, from the year 13, stands as an example of a monument not built by Augustus. And yet we must put this single theatre in the context of an Augustan takeover of the area. Alongside the new buildings built by Augustus himself, including the dominant Theatre of Marcellus, which completely dominates the area, what had been the porticus of Metellus, which is this one, was rebuilt in the name of Octavia, Augustus's sister. The porticus of Octavius, which is probably here, was also rebuilt by Augustus himself. He didn't change its name, which was nice of him. He didn't need to, since its original patron had the same name as him. Most famously, the Temple of Apollo here was rebuilt by Sosius. Here it is now. Originally intended to celebrate his own triumph in 34, it suffered a hiatus in construction when Sosius ended up on the wrong side at Actium. And when the restoration continued after Sosius's rehabilitation, its new iconography was indisputably Augustan. Its frieze probably depicts not Sosius's own triumph, but Augustus's triple triumph, 1, 2, 3. And its Dies Natalis was the 23rd of September, which is Augustus's birthday. So, not for nothing has the building work around the Circus Flaminius been discussed by Eugenio La Rocca under the title L'adesione senatoriale al consensus. In these projects, the narrative of elite competition is subsumed into a story about how the upper echelons of society, even those who were on the wrong side in the civil wars, are now coming together to work for a prosperous future under Augustus. So, we can see some final examples of individual senators building in Rome during the early Augustan era, but they definitely feel like the tail end of an older phenomenon. The idea wouldn't return until the baths of Licinius Sura in the time of Trajan, and we'll hear more about him later. On the whole, individual senators were no longer the preeminent patrons of monumental architecture in Rome under the empire, and the city was no longer their playground. That honor was reserved for the princeps himself and close allies related to him by blood or by marriage. But there was a significant subset of major urban interventions during the imperial period by one other patron, the Senate itself. The list of imperial monuments in Rome that were in fact commissioned by the Senate, or by the Senate and people together, includes some of Rome's most iconic pieces of art and architecture. the Arches of Constantine, the Arch of Constantine, Trajan's Column, the Arches of Titus and Septimius Severus, the Temple of the Divine Vespasian in the Forum. All of these were built by the Senate and Roman people together, which in practice means by the Senate. And the Areopagus was built by the Senate acting alone. These were important and highly visible interventions in the urban landscape. The Senate acting as a patron of building represents a massive change from the practices of the Republic. Before 49, the Senate as a group didn't usually build anything at all. It gave permission for things to be built. Sometimes it directed one of its magistrates to build something, but the Senate itself didn't build. Under the Empire, it was one of the most prominent patrons in the city, indeed the only prominent patron who was not directly attached to the imperial family. And this shift was noticed by Andrew Wallace Hadrill in 1990, but its implication for these buildings and how we should understand them have not been fully explored. The reasons for the shift are many and various. A lot of them worked in the new princeps' favour, and he probably did more than anyone else, quite deliberately, to make this change happen. As we've seen, Suetonius said that he encouraged other patrons to build, but he also made the game of competitive building utterly pointless. He was much richer, he was so much more powerful than anyone else. No one could compete with him. The game was over because he'd won. Together, though, the Senate could just about make their presence felt in the urban landscape. As a group, they had access to a position of traditional authority and to all the riches of the treasury. As time goes on, we see further adjustments in the relationship between the Senate, the city, and the emperor. When Vespasian was first proclaimed emperor, in the tense moment that was Rome's first handover to a new dynasty, one of the tasks that needed doing was to rebuild the large part of the city which had recently been burned. He took on the task and modestly refrained from putting his own name on the monuments he rebuilt. So far, the new dynasty seems willing to share the city with the Senate, and even with individual senators, though presumably the ones whose names are being restored here are safely dead rather than current senators. But even so, there were limits. The most prestigious building that needed renovation was the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus himself. Here, in a Senate meeting, the outspoken Senator Helvidius Priscus says that it should be done at public expense, that is, by the Senate with money that they released from the public treasury, and that Vespasian should help. He's crossing a line with this suggestion. The other senators tactfully pretend that they haven't heard him or that they can't remember what it was he said. At this point, building the temple to Rome's greatest god is a task for the emperor alone, and they all know it. And Vespasian does indeed do it. In fact, he does it himself in person. He's up there trugging away the rubble to clear the building site. Now this, I think, is something that the senators would not have liked at all. It's a nakedly populist move. And one of the things that the Senate does with its buildings, and this will be one of the topics of my third section, is to interpose itself between the emperor and the people. And we can see the Senate trying to reassert its place in the relationship between the emperor, the people, and the city. After trying to claim some portion of the repairs for themselves and failing, the senators at least make clear their role in thanking the emperor for what he has done. We might expect, after Vespasian's been carrying this rubble around on his own back, we might expect popular outpourings of gratitude. What we get is this, which is a lost base for a statue erected in his honor, very pointedly, by decree of the Senate. By Vespasian's time, then, the Senate was relating to the city entirely as a group, as the only possible alternative patron, the only counterweight that can even hope to compete with the emperor himself. So Helvidius Priscus wants the Senate to rebuild the Capitoline. He never suggests that he should rebuild the Capitoline, right? He never suggests that an individual should rebuild the Capitoline. Those days are gone. The idea of a Senate building as a group rather than individual senators building in competition is an important element in the history of the city of Rome, but it's also an important moment in the conception and the role of the Senate itself. It's now acting as a body rather than as a group of competing individuals, and that fits in well with scholars like Brunt, Talbot, Chastagnol, Rowe, have all found about the developing role of the Senate as a corporate entity during the early empire. So the first important conclusion that I want to draw is about a major change between Republic and Empire. We're not talking about senators in the city anymore, we're talking about the Senate and the city. Now, the senatorial monuments that I study are incredibly well-known buildings and works of art. They're all indelibly linked to emperors. They bear emperors' names because they were all built to honor emperors. They're often taken as interpretative keys to those emperors' propaganda or policies or even their personalities. But what I want to do is to ask what it would mean to take seriously the fact that these monuments were commissioned and funded by the Senate. The results, I think, affect our understanding of the monuments themselves, of the Imperial Senate and its relationship with the Emperor, and of processes of image-making and identity formation during the Roman Empire. In these monuments, we've got relief sculpture, inscriptions, topography, all kinds of other factors, creating meaning in the context of communication between senator, emperor, and people. And I believe that seeing senatorial monuments as expressions of the Senate's agency as well as the emperor's must transform the way in which we interpret the monuments themselves, the city in which they stood, and political identity and power relationships in Imperial Rome. So let's start here with the Ara Pacis Augusti, the altar of Augustan peace. Even more than many other senatorial monuments, it's often treated as a straightforward expression of imperial ideas, a direct emanation from the mind of Augustus. It's the centerpiece of everyone's undergraduate courses on the age of Augustus. But it's not an Augustan monument. It's not a monument built by Augustus. It was commissioned, paid for, and executed by the Senate in his honor. We've always known this. Augustus tells us so in his own words in the Res Gestae, his own autobiography. Now, there's not 1 inch of this monument that hasn't been interpreted and reinterpreted. From the identification of this female personification to the interpretation of the vegetal scroll work, from its architectural form to its location in the Campus Martius, and who is, oh no, we lost him. And there's another exciting frieze that no one can decide who he's supposed to be. There's no way that they can deal with any of these questions in the depth that they deserve tonight. But the iconographic key to the Ara Pacis Reda's senatorial monument must be the long processional frieze down the 2 long sides. Here we see no more and no less than a crowd of senators. If we look at the south frieze as a whole, first come various groups of priests, all senators, of course. Among them is the Emperor Augustus. And after these groups of priests, we've got a mixed group of men, women, and children, the men almost always wearing togas. Here's a closer look at that group. All previous scholarship, as far as I know, has automatically identified this mixed group as the imperial family. But there's another strong candidate, and one so thoroughly integrated into and overlapping with the imperial family that the difference is almost entirely one of emphasis. I identify this group as the Ordo Senatorius, the Senate of Rome, present for the supplicatio with their families. Of all the figures in the frieze, only 4 or 5 are strongly individualized by obvious portrait features. The portraits on the other side, incidentally, these ones are all modern restorations. Now, we can argue about what is and what is not a portrait. This is clearly a matter of art rather than science. But there's a difference here, right? There's a difference between this chap who's one of my 4 or 5, he's an individual. He might not be a real person, but he's been given some kind of difference about his face. And this chap, who's basically the Doryphoros, right? He's also identical to this one. The majority of faces on the monument are clearly and surely deliberately anonymous, or at least anonymized. Even really important ones, like this woman, who's clearly someone important. She's distinguished by her veil. But major important scholars can't agree on whether she should be Livia, Augustus's wife, or Julia, his daughter. The vast majority of figures here represent roles rather than individuals. Plenty of identifications have been proposed for each figure on the frieze. Some have drawn consensus, some are fiercely debated. Almost all of them, though, face a problem of circularity. The usual approach is to propose that a certain figure must be so-and-so because she's pictured with children of the appropriate age, or because his position in the procession fits his social and political status at the time. The symmetry and balance of the resulting pattern is then used as a demonstration that the identifications are correct, when in fact those were the criteria that were used to suggest them in the first place. And in any case, only a tiny minority of those who saw the monument would have had the knowledge or inclination to pick out and identify individuals, especially when they didn't even look like the figures they supposedly represented. Even for those closely acquainted with Rome's elite, the frieze's careful anonymization makes it more about the roles than the people. And most of all, its message was conveyed not by details of hairstyle or shape of nose which are invisible from the ground, but by its overall visual impact. It's a mass of toe-gate figures with some women and children. Some of them are distinguished by markers of office like their priestly attire, but others were presumably just wearing the purple stripe of a senator on their tunics, and they process together towards a religious ceremony. They don't look like anyone in particular, they look like Rome's elite. They look like Rome's Senate and Rome's senatorial families. The carefully anonymized figures in the procession, representing a range of different ages and roles, even if they don't represent particular individuals, meant that any senator could see himself and his family there. The spatial representation allows them to claim literal closeness to the princeps, and the presence of carefully identified figures such as the flamines, which are the ones here in silly hats, demonstrates some of the privileges which were accessible to individual members of Rome's highest class. Now, of course, there are some portraits on the altar. Augustus is given a portrait, but you can really only see it from this angle, which is not achievable without dressing up as a tourist and going in and having one of those big, long selfie sticks. Nowadays, he's very easy to pick out. We all teach our undergraduates to identify Augustus on the Areopagus. They don't identify him by details of his hairstyle. They identify him because he's got half a face. He comes right at the end of one of the surviving slabs. But imagine the altar being whole. It would have been much harder to pick him out. In the context of the frieze as a whole, Augustus, the princeps, is carefully positioned not only as a charismatic guarantor of pax, but as primus inter pares. He's one of them. He's hardly distinguished by dress or position. My suggestion that the figures on the frieze should represent the Senate and their families can be made without whole-scale changes in the traditional identification of figures even, because to a great extent the imperial family was a subset of the Ordo Senatorius. The senior consul of 13 BCE was none other than Tiberius. If we see him in one of the foreground figures on the frieze, should we expect him to be there as Livia's son or as the chief magistrate of the Roman state? The overlaps between imperial family and senate and the ease with which senators moved socially among the princeps' immediate kin must have been a point of pride for many senators. Perhaps we should even see a deliberate ambiguity in the frieze, meant to suggest exactly this line of thinking. We can't tell if it's the imperial family or the senatorial families of Rome, because really they're all one and the same. So, this altar is a lot of things. It's an honor to Augustus, and I'll talk about that more later, but it's also a senatorial self-portrait. It's a musing on what it is to be a senator, which is putting forward a particularly senatorial view about what the imperial family means, what the families of the senators mean to Rome. It's a highly visible demonstration to a wide audience of how important it is to be a senator, and a statement about the relationship between the princeps and the senators. So this pretty obvious pattern that senators appear on senatorial monuments gets repeated again and again. Here is the triumphal relief from the Arch of Titus. Zoom in to take a little bit of a better look. What we've got here is we've got Titus in his chariot being crowned by victory. He's attended by Onos here with the bare chest and Virtus with the helmet. He's also attended by exactly 12 lictors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then these three guys. Who are they? What is their role? Fanner, who wrote the definitive monograph on the arch, doesn't give them a lot of consideration. He identifies our three figures as senators, which must be true. They're standing there in their togas, looking very senatorial. He notes that senators did sometimes take part in triumphal processions, and that there are parallels for togati being pictured behind the emperor. But his parallels aren't very good. There's a relief of a triumph from Palestrina showing Trajan, which has two figures in short togas behind the emperor, but they're carrying fasces. They're very clearly lictors. They should belong with these ones. There just wasn't room to fit them in. He also cites a 3rd century terracotta vase with relief medallions which show a burlesque triumphal procession of Isis. I have no idea who this person is, but I don't think he's a very good comparandum for the senators on the Arch of Titus. In fact, there aren't a lot of comparanda. In fact, I don't think there are any comparanda for togate figures following close behind the chariot of a triumphator like this. Most often, the triumphator is shown alone or just with his direct attendants and relevant personifications. So Trajan here has his lictors, Marcus Aurelius is on his own, Marius here is on his own. And this composition on the Arch of Titus, it forms a unit, right? It's not a snapshot of part of the parade. It's got an internal coherence. These guys go together. These three aren't just there because they happen to be next in the queue, right? They've been included for a reason. This is a unit of the emperor and the people who are most important to him. And that includes here these three senators. From literary sources, we know that walking immediately behind the chariot of a triumphator was a particular honor. It was a sign that you had played a particularly valuable role in the campaign. I don't know whether senators actually did walk directly behind Titus's chariot during his triumph. Probably not, actually. This relief is not trying to be an accurate historical record. It's a claim that the Senate, represented here by these three anonymized senators in which any senator could see himself, had an important place in Titus's army and a place of honor in his triumph, that they were part of his inner circle. Really, I think the closest comparandum to this relief is actually something like this. Medieval and Renaissance art, which includes the patron somewhere in the corner, giving him a small taste of the glory. Trajan's column is another interesting case. One of the very exciting things about its narrative frieze is how much effort the sculptors put into identifying different groups of people, different infantry soldiers, different kinds of cavalry, auxiliaries of different kinds wearing different uniforms. Scholars have argued that this is a very deliberate attempt to speak to a range of audiences. Everyone could see themselves on the column. But the one group which must have stood out most vividly were in fact senators. In his 60 or so appearances on the column, the Emperor Trajan is almost always surrounded by a group of high-ranking advisors who would naturally have been senators. It makes Trajan look good. Of course, all this is to his greater glory, but it also makes a point about how important the senators are to him. Now, they're no longer shown in their civil role as members of the religious and political governing council of Rome, like they were on the Areopagus and perhaps even on the Arch of Titus, but they're always shown wearing the same clothing as the emperor. They're the only figures, apart from the emperor, who wear this particular outfit, this sort of general's uniform, which we should imagine was picked out in bright colors. They're shown conversing with him. They're shown advising him. When he changes his clothes, they change their clothes too to match him. So here they are in traveling clothes. And in fact, one of the most striking things is how very closely their poses, their composition match his, right? So here's Trajan, here's someone else. Even the fold here, the length of his skirty thing, the way he's standing, the composition is a perfect echo of the emperor. The same stance, the same fold, the same relationship to the defeated Dacians and the obedient soldiers. Now, this particular chap here, who occurs a couple of times, is usually identified as Licinius Sura, one of Trajan's closest advisors, of course himself a senator. I mentioned him a little while ago. because he was the first senator after Balbus in the teens BCE, so after a gap of 80 years, he was the first senator to build in his own name a prestigious public building in the city of Rome, the Baths of Licinius Sura on the Aventine. So should we read his prominence on the column as something about him in particular, about his uniquely privileged position? Is he more of an Agrippa, who we can discount? I would argue not, because yes, he's special, he's individual, but who's this guy? Like the senators on the Arch of Titus or the Areopagus, even if we're supposed to understand that this is a particular person, Licinius Sura, this is a generic senator. He's a role in which any senator could put himself. It's a statement about the importance of senators as high-ranking officers and advisors in Trajan's army more generally, not just about one man. And just to finish with one more example, here are the senators on the new frieze of the Arch of Constantine. Constantine's here in the center. The people are standing on the ground around him, and the senators are here, up on the rostra with him, in a privileged position with a privileged relationship to the emperor. So there's much more to say about each of these examples. For now, the interim conclusion that I want you to take away is that the senatorial monuments do show a special interest in portraying senators, which strengthens my argument that we really should see them as actually senatorial, rather than as just another mechanism by which the emperor made his mark on the landscape. And that it is possible that it's one potential line of attack to examine these different representations of senators to draw conclusions about senatorial identity and the complex and changing relationship between the Senate and the emperor. These representations of senators also come back to the conclusion of my first section, that the imperial Senate had a corporate identity in a way that the Republican Senate never did. No Republican senator would have wanted to be portrayed like this, or like this, as just one member of an anonymized group. They didn't want to be one of these three guys, they wanted to be this guy, right? They wanted to be the one in the chariot. But imperial senators had to take into account the reality that there was always going to be one man who sucked up most of the attention, most of the glory, who won the competition. How could they possibly deal with him? On the Areopagus, they make a statement that he's just one of us. It's not that dissimilar on Trajan's column, right? I look exactly like him. Primus inter pares. On the Arch of Titus, something different is going on. The emperor is very clearly set apart, but the Senate have their own specific role. It becomes even clearer on other Flavian monuments, like the Cancellaria reliefs. We don't know that this is definitely from a senatorial monument, but I certainly wouldn't exclude it. Keep in mind this figure here, but I will flick to an actual senatorial monument, the Arch of Trajan at Benevento. Now, these chaps surrounding the emperor, sacrificing, they look like a group of togati, not unlike the Areopagus. But if you look closely, you'll see that, again, they are all lictors, right? They've all got these fasces, and there's also some sacrificial attendants in the group. But along with the lictors and the sacrificial attendants, now, rather than three generic senators, we get this bearded figure, this allegorical figure of the Genius Senatus, who personifies the Senate as a whole and interacts with the emperor. These representations make a slightly different statement. Now, it's not the Senate saying the emperor is one of us, he's just like us. It's saying that we have a different role. We can deal with the fact that the emperor has so conclusively won the game by putting him in a different league entirely. He's not part of our game, he doesn't count. So we've got these two discourses. He's one of us and he's not one of us. And I'm not actually trying to argue for a chronological change here. I think we can see them both throughout the imperial period. Instead, what I want to emphasize is something that they have in common. He's one of us, he's not one of us. They both raise the question of who us is. Who are we? To conceptualize their relationship to the princeps, the senators first had to conceptualize their own identity. And the two discourses that I've suggested both rely not only on individual identity, but on group identity. To show him as one of us on the Areopagus, they've had to come up with a new form of representation of us, a really unparalleled artistic experiment. And to show him as not one of us, they're relying on another fairly new mode of representation, a new iconography for the personification of the Senate. Now, my senatorial monuments are all honorific monuments. They all glorify the emperors concerned and can be read as fitting neatly into the broader themes of those emperors' imagery and ideological messages. Let's not forget, the Areopagus is the altar of Augustan peace. The arches would have been crowned by images of the emperors riding in triumphal chariots. The column was the resting place for Trajan's ashes. But the fact that these monuments are honours for an emperor doesn't mean that they can't also be statements of senatorial agency. And the fact that they're part of a broader programme of art and architecture doesn't invalidate their senatorial provenance either. In fact, it should prompt us to take a closer look at the creation and evolution of imperial visual languages and the messages that they disseminated. The elements of this discourse didn't all emanate directly and in an uncomplicated way from the top. Rather, a range of patrons had a role in its creation, and of these, the Senate was one of the most important. The Imperial Senate spent a fair amount of its time decreeing honours to the princeps. Tacitus, Dio, and Suetonius all describe these debates, and we even have the evidence of epigraphically preserved decrees. We'll never know to what extent the whole thing might have been rigged by backroom discussions, by freedmen carrying messages to and fro, and to be honest, I don't think it's a particularly interesting question. There must have been a spectrum. Some of these monuments were decreed independently by the Senate, some of them were coerced by the emperor. So the many arches built under Domitian, each voted by the Senate, not to mention the ridiculously grandiose Equus Domitiani, which stood 11 meters high in the middle of the forum. If you think of the statue of Marcus Aurelius, it comes up to about here. Right, this thing is gigantic. A person is sort of this high. This ridiculous monument, it was definitely an official senatorial monument. It was voted by the Senate. Here it is pictured on a coin with the letters SC, by decree of the Senate. And it was almost certainly a coerced monument, right? They didn't come up with this on their own. This is Domitian's brainchild, not the Senate's. It might even have had a second inscription, alongside the inscription that named it as a senatorial monument, a second inscription in the first person singular, written by Domitian. So this was a coerced monument. But for the other end of the spectrum, we can look at the Arch of Constantine, which was voted and designed for an emperor who was almost entirely absent from Rome. The senators who commissioned it will have had very little guidance of any kind about what he wanted. And all of these monuments, even the Equus Domitiani, would have failed in their purpose as honours if they appeared to have been produced entirely at the emperor's behest. In the final reckoning, they had to look real even if they weren't. The details of their decoration literally lay in the hands of their sculptors, and the designers who oversaw the final composition of their visual programs were probably also artists rather than politicians. But the initiative, at least officially, came from the Senate, and the funds to build these monuments were released by the Senate. And let's not forget, Romans did care who commissioned monuments. Even if these honours were completely coerced, that's not how they were presented to a public audience. Augustus, as we've seen, makes a point of telling his readers that the Areopagus was voted for him by the Senate. And let's take a look at the Arch of Titus. Here's the inscription. Senatus, you can translate that. Difficult to read, difficult to read, difficult to read. Where's Titus? Oh, here's Titus. Here. Quite hard to pick out, especially from the ground. Really, from the ground, the word Senatus is the only word you can read. Van Heemskerk has it right. Senatus, squiggle, squiggle, something. So, these are honours, but honours are important. They're not just expressions of civility. They do more than just honour. They're prescriptive as well as descriptive. They make statements about how the honoree ought to act. Take, for example, the Clipeus Virtutis, the shield of virtues that was given to Augustus by the Senate and people. They honoured him for his virtus, which we will leave in Latin where it belongs, his justice, his clemency, and his piety towards the gods and his fatherland. That was a choice they made. They could have honoured him for his liberality, and they didn't. As Catherine Welch has pointed out, most distinctly, they didn't honour him for his piety towards his father, which was one of the pylons of his own ideological messaging at this period. This was a nudge, and not particularly a subtle one, away from the politics of revenge and towards a different approach. The shield says that we honour you for your virtus, clemency, justice, and piety. It means we would like some virtus, clemency, justice, and piety. We honour you in these terms. We suggest that you had better continue living up to them if you want to continue to receive our honours. What's more, honours also make claims about the importance of the body doing the honouring. We are important. Our support for you is important. You should feel honoured to be honoured by us. If there's a single message of these monuments and of this lecture, that's it. The senator had, for the entire imperial period, a monopoly on honouring the emperor with prestigious monuments in the city of Rome. These were the most prestigious honours available, and the Senate wanted to make sure that the emperor knew that it was they who could provide them. They succeeded in that. They succeeded in maintaining their monopoly on honouring the emperor with buildings. But it was by no means a foregone conclusion. The Senate sometimes had to and did fight to create and to maintain its status as the foremost provider of honours. They faced two main problems in maintaining their position in this delicate ecosystem. One was other groups who wanted to honour the emperor, and the other was the emperor himself. Because Senate and emperor were not the only parties involved in the negotiation of honours or the communicative networks that they created. Under the Republic, the institution entitled to bestow the most prestigious honours on individuals was not the Senate, actually, but the people. Now, here we're not talking about monumental honours. Republican generals and their families, as I began this lecture with, erected their own honorific arches at their own expense. There were very, very few honorific monuments erected at public expense in the closing decades of the Republic, but these were generally put up by the people, acting independently of the Senate. And in fact, there was a tradition of grassroots honours, so not even voted by the people, but just put up by people, for particularly popular leaders. And those actually tended to take the form of altars. So the Senate's choice to start honouring Caesar officially, and then Augustus, at public expense, and particularly to do so with the Areopagus in altar form, was a pointed intervention. When the Senate took over the commissioning of these honorific monuments, taking away the people's active role or subsuming them in a formulaic SPQR, they did at least three things. They honoured the emperor and proclaimed their own loyalty to him. They asserted their own importance to the regime as the provider of prestigious honours, which helped the emperors claim that they respected republican traditions and based their rule on consensus. And in a boldly innovative move, they inserted themselves into and claimed control over some of the patterns of communication which had begun to develop between the people and popular leaders. They made themselves the conduit, thereby inventing for themselves a new and vital role. So that was the first threat. They more or less succeeded in positioning themselves as the sole conduit between other groups who wanted to honour the emperor and the emperor himself, at least when it comes to buildings like this. But the second threat was the emperor himself. And I don't just mean the bad emperors who coerced honours from the Senate. In the end, that just went to show how important senatorial honours were. In fact, it was the good emperors who were more of a threat, the ones who refused senatorial honours. The honour that was traditionally wielded by the Republican Senate to reward and indeed to punish its own members was the triumph. And this, unlike all the other forms of honour to which a Roman elite man might aspire, had usually been in the gift of the Senate rather than the people. Factions within the Senate used it as a pawn in countless political games. But Augustus had specifically taken this honour off the table. He refused further triumphs for himself after 29, and in practice, he restricted them to members of the imperial family after 19. Individual senators must have been pretty galled by the fact that they could no longer aspire to this honour. For the senators as a group, though, some parts of Augustus's attitude to the triumph could be seen in a more flattering light. Perhaps this disavowal was the act of a civilis princeps. He's avoiding envy. He's refusing to set himself too far apart by repeated triumphs. But a third facet, which hasn't previously been noted, is that by refusing to have triumphs, Augustus also took away one of the Senate's most prestigious and long-established prerogatives, the act of granting a triumph. Under the Republic, they'd used this power to claim some measure of control over the glorious narratives of the various successful generals that they rewarded. Now, they were prevented from doing the same for Augustus's victories. Any pretense that the Senate had real control over foreign wars was long gone, but by refusing triumphs, Augustus denied them what remained even of that tiny part in the process. The Senate needed to come up with something new, some new role for themselves, and that's why, I think, we get so many so-called triumphal arches for emperors, even when there's no triumph. And the Areopagus falls under the same rubric too. Augustus had refused a triumph. The Senate voted him an altar of peace, placing their stamp of approval on his actions and reminding him, reminding themselves, reminding the people that they were the one body which was traditionally given responsibility for deciding when war was over, when the empire was at peace. Similarly, we know that the Senate had originally voted Vespasian and Titus separate triumphs for the war in Judea. But the father and son gainsaid the Senate. They refused what the Senate wanted, and they decided to have a joint triumph. The Arch, though, doesn't talk about a joint triumph at all. The Arch is a memorial of the triumph of Titus that never actually happened. Of course, it's much more than that, and I could go on about this monument in particular, the role of Domitian versus the Senate, the fact that this was erected after Titus's death, but it's time to draw to a close. So, the act of honouring is prescriptive as well as descriptive. The rich sculptural decoration of the monuments themselves, as well as the language of the decrees in which they were commissioned, illustrate which achievements and virtues of the emperor were being honoured. And they didn't necessarily just recognise virtues that the emperor himself valued. They also constitute a message from Senate to emperor about what kind of behaviour in future would result in their continued support. Even though in practice many honours were coerced from the Senate, the fact that the emperor still worked within its honorific traditions legitimised its place in the state and that of individual senators. Honorific traditions evolved over time, but the consistency with which the Senate alone was responsible for large-scale honorific monuments in this city of Rome is a remarkable testament to the continuity of the Senate's importance. In summary, to see these monuments as records of a process of communication between emperor, Senate, and people can help us understand them better. It can also illuminate a bit more the tensions within that process, which I think were creative tensions, which I think were tensions that never disappeared, and which I think were tensions that gave the Senate a real role. The relationship between the emperor and the Senate was not always antagonistic, but it was always characterized by imperfect and asymmetrical sharing of power and information. So when they want to honor the princeps, they're trying to think about what he's going to want, but they don't necessarily know what it is that he wants. Negotiations were complex. Sometimes they were forced to guess what the emperor might want. Sometimes he had to choose from among options that they presented to him, none of which might match his wishes entirely. And sometimes entirely new ideas or iconography could emerge from this interaction. Once images are disseminated, they're hard to take back. And new imagery and even new ideology could thus enter public discourse without the emperor's active participation. So I'm thinking about everything from the imagery of peace and prosperity in the Areopagus, which is so fundamental to how we understand the Augustan age, to the cryptic inscription of the Arch of Constantine, which some have taken to be the first mention of the Christian god in Roman official media. These are senatorial monuments, monuments which the Senate had to decide to erect, which had to design, maybe without a huge amount of impact of interaction with the emperor himself. They're senatorial monuments. They're imperial monuments too. And of course I've been concentrating on one side of the story today, because it's the side of the story that's less told. We should never forget that these are imperial monuments. This is a very nice little relief with three figures standing in a corner. It's on an arch which is crowned by a giant statue of Titus riding in triumph, possibly in a chariot pulled by elephants. But if we take them seriously as senatorial, we can see these monuments and the workings of the Imperial Senate in a new light. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A fantastic panorama of important monuments presented in this very different light, and lots and lots to talk about. Many people here are rather better qualified than I am to do so, but it's my duty to throw a first kind of full toss outside the off stump for you to bat away. One question is, okay, all right, you've got a triangle of the Senate and the Emperor, and there's this thing called populace, which you determinedely refuse to give any credit to whatsoever.
Yes.
Okay, let's deal with the poor old populace.
The populace is also a very, very important part of the equation. Actually, for most of the monuments that I'm talking about today, they say Senatus Populusque on them, but the populace never voted on them at all, right? Or if they did, the Senate could put matters forward to the populace for a vote, by which time they'd already started building the thing. There are also monuments where the populace seems to play a larger role. In the Augustan Forum, we seem to have two monuments, one dedicated by the Senate and one by the populace. So there must have been some kind of coordination there. But in practice, when we actually look at how these things were decreed, how they were debated, how the different elements come together, and what we actually get, we get these debates in the Senate, in Tacitus and in Suetonius and Dio, and they're fantastic. And each senator makes a little proposition to add on to the lot. So someone says, oh, we should have an arch, and then someone says, oh, we should have a triple arch. Someone says, oh, it should have gilded letters on it. It should have a relief on it that shows this. It should have a statue on it that shows that. So everyone's adding their own little thing. And then if it gets presented to the people at all, it gets presented to them as a job lot, which they just approve. So clearly, the fact that the people are included in the formula is important and needs thinking through, but what we don't have is any kind of popular agency, right? The people aren't actually involved in making decisions about what these monuments are going to look like, or even whether there's going to be a monument or not. They have a purely responsive role in that process of commissioning. Once they're erected, the people are incredibly important, because in as much as these monuments are messages to the emperor, quite a lot of the time, more of the time they're messages to the people, right? They get seen more often by members of the people, so they're saying something to the people about the importance of the Senate, I think, as provider of honours and as conduit between people and princeps, I think.
Yeah, thank you for a very inspiring lecture, very interesting indeed, and I think as soon as you talk about the emperor and about the Senate as a body, then of course somewhere there lurks the idea of the duarchy, which Theodor Mommsen presented, and of course it's an outdated theory in that he was too much emphasizing these two power structures, but there is modern discussion as well, of course. Alois Winterling in Berlin has been writing about it, I think very sensible things. But when indeed you regard the Senate as a body, then of course I think that's also something that Augustus was very much involved in, after all, the Ordo Senatorius, because we can also see how he is interested in forging the Ordo Equester. They are needed, as it were, in order to prop up his government. So I mean, there too I would not put them maybe as much at loggerheads in general. also, of course, we know that the Romans governed their provinces by, above all, making use of the elite. That is always how the Romans governed. So I would think that it is natural also for the emperor to indeed, at least emperors who know their job, as it were, to act precisely in this way. And of course, over these 300 years, we'll see many differences. And that's also something that, of course, you did mention. It's not always the same, and the Senate will surely not always take recourse to the same measures in order to further their identity, because it does depend on the emperor. And I think that the Senate is probably not always as monolithic as that. And you just, in replying to Christopher, you pointed out that when you have a discussion taking place, you will have many views. And of course, even just by reading Tacitus, we get precisely this view. There are always those people who actually try to flatter the emperor above all, although they are senators, and then there are people who are more principled and so forth. So that's also something that I think is important when you try to figure out in actual detail or the mechanisms for how it all comes together.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. Yeah, the Senate isn't a monolith. I mean, I want to reinsert senatorial agency into the picture, but I actually find myself a lot of the time agreeing with the people who don't see a lot of real debate going on in the Senate. Augustus, and especially we know this for Claudius and some of the other emperors, they're constantly trying to get the Senate to act as a useful governing council, to give them good advice, to have good debates, and the Senate refuse. And they come up with ever more innovative ways of doing this, that they start cold calling them, as you might with an undergraduate asking them for an irregular verb, rather than going around in sequence.
I've not been taught by you.
So there are debates in the Senate, but a lot of the time the debates are about how to honour the emperor, right? Which ways to honour the emperor. They found a kind of unanimity that they never had during the Republic. Diarchy is also an interesting one. Mommsen's diarchy, primarily, he starts talking about it when he starts talking about the coinage. That the Senate is in charge of the bronze coinage and the emperor is in charge of the silver and gold. I think the coinage is really interesting because it also has these big letters SC on it. I talked about this, some of you were there. And I'm not entirely sure that, Vintling is a slightly different case, but I'm not entirely sure that Mommsen really meant his diarchy to go as far as it's been taken by a lot of people since, right? That's an administrative disjunction rather than anything else, which you can see very clearly in the coinage. Being able to coin bronze gives the Senate actually what I think is a very, very visible platform that people around the empire, well, certainly around Italy, know who they are, know what they're doing, know that they're important, know that they're an important authority, but it doesn't actually give them any real power. There were other things you said, but... the Ordo Equester, yes. It's not a triangle, it's much more than a triangle. The Ordo Equester is a very big player as well, though they're not very big on monumental building, which is...
Peter out somehow. They are important during Augustus and later in different periods, but then the somewhat dissolved a little bit.
Yeah, and you start, again, talking about how the Senate isn't a monolith. Actually, in the early empire, the move is towards a kind of flattening of hierarchy within the elite, because it's Augustus and everyone else. And then as the emperor goes on, you start developing new hierarchies within the elite, which start to involve the equestrians as well as the Senate, and senatorial status becomes an important thing for distinguishing yourself from various procurators and so on. Yes. But if you think about Flave's acceptance system, so he's got these various groups that the emperor needs to get the consent of in order to rule. And in one reading of that, actually, the really important one is the Senate. They're the only ones he needs to persuade, right? The army, the plebs, there are mechanisms of donatives, well-established mechanisms of donatives and things to get them on board. Whereas the Senate needs to be persuaded or coerced And if you coerce that, then that's actually dangerous, because the well-established, well, at least, in the early empire, the only established way of getting rid of an emperor is by assassination from the elite. Sorry, that answer took a wandering turn, but...
Other questions, thoughts, contributions? Yes. One there and then one there, please.
Wasn't the unanimity just because they killed off all the people that were anti?
To a certain extent, yes. You knew that if you didn't join the party line, then you were in great danger of getting killed off, absolutely. There's a demographic change. So I've been comparing the Imperial Senate with, the great men of the Republican Senate, the ones who wanted to be riding the Triumphal chariot. I think most of the Republican Senate at least dreamed of seeing themselves in that position. Even Cicero did, a new man, he wanted to have a triumph. But this, the absolutely dyed-in-the-wool, till-I-die individualism that you see in some Republican senators is a feature of the very, very high elite, right? That's your Scipios, right? That's your Athena Barbie. Not necessarily the massive backbenchers. So Simon's argument that the key thing that happens between Republican Empire is a demographic shift, that suddenly we've got these sort of second-order people coming up into the higher ranks. In some ways, that could help explain what I'm talking about, that we've got fewer of these individual tall poppies who want to stand out in their own right. The backbenchers have won, right? We're all at RE now. We're all going to accept that we're happy with this status of senators of the Roman Empire. We don't necessarily want to excel in and of ourselves. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes.
Well, yes.
That line about some people remember seems a little bit spooky.
Oh, well, that's
dangerous.
His job to spook you.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. And I'm going to fit the stereotype of myself and ask you a question about the Arpakis. And when you talk about this idea of who is creating the idea of a Senate as a body, and when you talk about the frieze, it seems in a way that you're suggesting that the Senate themselves are capitalizing on the idea, or desirous of the idea of being presented as a body, one that is intermingling with the imperial family, that this is what they want. And the Arapakis, though, is a monument I think maybe presents more complications. As we get the impression from Dio that what the Senate envisioned for this monument was potentially a small altar in the Curia. And then all of a sudden the thing that gets built is on Augustus's property. And then add on to that, that in this period, the treasury seems to be made up of all of Augustus's money rather than a public money. And who's controlling the purse strings, where it's being built, that even if the Senate had a choice about the imagery, Augustus seems to have a heavy hand on the ultimate idea of what this monument is.
Yeah, no, so with the Arapakis, it's really interesting because we've got this wonderful thing, and we've got some references in the literary sources, and they don't match up at all. So the best we can do is to reconstruct that as kind of a process of negotiation, where the Senate has proposed one thing, Augustus says, let's try something slightly different. I think I would then say that they come back with, okay, let's try this. I would still want to include senatorial initiative there. But it is really, really interesting that the first thing that they propose is an altar in the Curia. So it's a monument by senators for senators, right? It's communicating with themselves. I think in the end, it has a larger audience and a larger message. But I think the monument by senators for senators is still there. I think this is still a kind of communication among senators about who we're going to be, about how we're still important. So I think we can make these things jive together. Maybe it's just a matter of where you stand.
Thank you. I was just wondering to what extent this participation of the Senate in monuments and the sort of language that you're talking about them using is exclusive to the city of Rome or indeed Italy, because you mentioned Beneventum as one example. So I just wondered how this plays out differently or not differently in the city of Rome.
So there are senatorial monuments outside Rome. There's the Arch of Trajan at Benevento. There's also an Arch of Trajan at Ancona. There's even some outside Italy. There's the Triumphal at La Tourville, which is senatorial. There's a couple of others. Not a lot. Not as many as this huge number that we get in Rome. But what I think is important is, the ones outside Rome don't form a pattern, right? I mean, the two Arches of Trajan, I would almost say that they should be counted as metropolitan monuments. They're clearly for a metropolitan audience. They're in places which are really important transport links to the city. They're designed for a Roman audience, not necessarily for an Italian audience. Things like La Tourville, I don't know who that's designed for. It's in the middle of nowhere. Well, I know who it's designed for. The main purpose of it is the issuing of the decree, rather than the fact of the monument in itself. I think the audience is still metropolitan. But what's more important is that the Senate in Rome is different, because in Rome no one else is doing this. Whereas beyond Rome, and across the empire, all kinds of people are building monuments to the emperor, building monuments of exactly this genre to the emperor. Right, the first monumental arch with statues of the imperial family on it is built in Ephesus by two imperial freedmen. Right, so it's only in Rome that this kind of building has the special cachet about it. So that's why I think the Rome stuff is worth concentrating on. The stuff outside Rome wouldn't necessarily have had so much of an impact. Doesn't tell such an interesting story.
Thank you, Amy. As you'll appreciate, my ignorance comes from about a century after Van Heemskerk, but I can just about read the word senatus as well in the 16th, 17th centuries I work on. I'm fascinated. If the shift is between individual senators in competition under the Republic, trying to outbuild each other in the public arena, to a corporate body of senators trying to build together, what are the individual senators doing with their own money?
So what you get, the typical narrative is that you turn inwards. So there's more investment in luxury interior decoration, small but exquisite, fourth-style decoration that you have to come up very close to see, rather than, massive second-style decoration that blows you away from across the room. But also a lot more is going on outside Rome. So they sort of abandon the city of Rome, the individuals abandon the city of Rome and leave it to Augustus and his family, and then the later emperors. But outside Rome, they've got rather more of a free hand. They're allowed to be the little emperors in their own hometowns. They're allowed to build massive tombs. They're allowed to donate bath complexes and fora and things like that to small towns around the empire, either where they're from or that they become patrons of. So this kind of competition doesn't change, but the media for it shift. But it's just that the city of Rome takes on this very special status.
Is it? Oh, yes.
I just, on this topic, I think Rome is still important for them, though, and of course, by law, they need to own property in Italy, and most convenient for those who come from Asia Minor or Spain is that they own it pretty close to Rome so that they can attend the Senate meeting. So but you are right that they are looking more inwards, but I think that they want to have, we would call them palaces in Rome. The only thing is that we don't find them so much just because of how Rome has developed, but down there, I think there are foundations of many senatorial palaces. And of course, we have those famous lead pipes with inscriptions of senators, which also indicate that they did own property here. So I think that's an important thing, but I think that also has to do with what you were saying earlier about the ideals of senators. And of course, as you rightly pointed out, in the Republic, the dream is to be the triumphator going up to the Capitol. But I just wonder, 200 years later, you know, in the 2nd century CE, I think the role of the military was probably a little bit different at that level in society. It's still true that people did see troops, young men, I mean, they had to serve in the provinces commanding this and that, but maybe somewhat leisurely, and they weren't really professional soldiers, and they knew that there was no point in hoping for a triumph, they would never get one. So I think that the role of the military or military ideals must have been slightly different, like even today in the UK or in many countries, maybe not so much the US perhaps, but the importance of an admiral and a general is so much less today than it was even maybe 50 years ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And something that you know more about than I do is I want to find out a bit more how much this trend really bears out. That as the emperors sort of start to leave Rome, we also see these big aristocratic houses becoming much more prominent in the landscape. But yes, you're right that they never entirely go, but it's much more private space rather than public space, and the actual geographical distribution of it changes, that the emperors take over the spaces that were the really tony neighborhoods during the Republic. And leisure, absolutely. I mean, you can see in Pliny, people who do literary work on sort of Tacitus and Pliny and Dio, and how they sort of portray their own role as senators, and the role of literary leisure as being an important part of their sort of noblesse oblige even, and the military service being much more important. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Well, Amy's given us a fascinating insight into the mechanisms whereby over time a body of the elite tries to manage the existence of a figure who has popped out above them and potentially challenging their existence. How does one deal with such a situation? We may all of us be thinking about that over the coming weeks, but perhaps now we can thank Amy enormously for this terrific lecture, so much to think about, and then go and celebrate the beginning of